Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today I'm talking about the 10 best-selling punk albums of all time. There's a bunch of links down below. Make sure you check them out. There's links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlists we put together every week, and the Patreon page. Make sure you go check all that out. Of course, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me the old thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So over the last couple of days, I was looking around online to see exactly what were the best-selling punk albums of all time. Not because I was going to do a video on it, I was just kind of curious. And I was kind of running into a lot of issues trying to find really accurate information. I did find one website that claimed to have the top 10 albums listed. But then when I started sorting, scrolling down through the list, some of them seemed like way out of place. I think it had the Offspring's debut album at number 3 or number 4. I know that Smash and Americana both sold a lot more than their debut album. So, right away I was looking at, I think they also had, the Bad Brains debut album listed with more sales numbers than, Never Mind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols. Right away, I knew that the sales numbers on that website were off. So that's what kind of started me down this rabbit hole into digging through all these different numbers, trying to find out exactly what were the 10 best-selling punk albums. I know punk music seems like a really small subgenre, but there were a few years where, some of these bands, some of these albums really blew up, had really big sales numbers. So of these 10 albums combined, almost 110 million copies sold worldwide, which is a whole lot for what you think you would get from punk music. I guess I should add that, is this 100% accurate? No, because it was really hard to find really accurate sales numbers. I did go through a couple of different websites. I went through what the band claimed. I also went through and looked to see what the label also had. And as far as gold record sales numbers and things like that from around the world, kind of put all that together and came up with this top 10 list. So at number 10, this album was released back in 2002. It sold 4 million copies. It was a huge album. It was everywhere. I remember you couldn't turn on TRL without seeing the band pretty much every day or every other day, it seemed like. That album is The Young and the Hopeless by Good Charlotte. It's not my favorite Good Charlotte album, but this is a really good one. This is the album that really kind of took them from your kind of average, early 2000s pop punk band and really kind of put them up into the stratosphere. I was a little surprised by the album at number 9. It's an album that I figured would be higher up the list just because how hugely influential this album was. It really is. It's probably one of the most influential punk albums of the last, 45 plus years. It's influenced a whole lot of music throughout the 80s and even into the 90s. That album is Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols by the Sex Pistols. This one sold a little bit more than The Young and the Hopeless, a little over 4 million copies, was released back in 1977. Like I said, I'm not a huge fan of the band, but this is easily one of the most influential punk albums. Number 8's kind of along the same lines as the Sex Pistols. I thought this would be a lot higher up the list. A great album, one of my favorite albums of all time, definitely one of my favorite punk albums. But this one sold a little over 5 million copies, released back in 1979, and that is London Calling by The Clash. This is an album that took me a little while to get into. I didn't start getting into punk until the 93, 94, it was probably 94, 95 is really when I started getting into punk with Dookie and Out Come the Wolves by Rancid. Those are the two albums that really got me into punk. So it's probably 95 or so when I started getting into bands like Operation Ivy, The Clash, The Ramones, some of that kind of older stuff. And this is a great album. Like I said, easily one of my favorite albums of all time. Easily one of my favorite punk albums. Number 7 is an album that is kind of the complete opposite from the last two. I was surprised that this one actually sold as much as it did. But this one was released back in 2003, sold 6 million copies. I absolutely love this album. This is easily one of my top 3 or 4 albums of all time. And that is Untitled by Blink-182. I know a lot of people look at this album and say, oh, it's not punk music. But Blink is a punk band. I know there's definitely more, there's some emo influence on here. This album influenced a lot of emo music in the early part of the 2000s, but there's a lot of rock stuff on here. There's some new wave stuff on here. Very interesting album, very different than what Blink did earlier in their career, but it sold 6 million copies, man, so that's a lot for this album. At number 6 is an album that I knew would be on this list. It was, just like everything else I've talked about so far, it's huge. It was everywhere. This is an album that came out back in 1998, sold 11 million copies, or over 11 million copies, and it was such a big album, such a popular album, that my wife even had this on CD back in the day, and she was into a lot of like pop and R&B and stuff like that in the later part of the 90s, and this is an album that she even loved. That album is Americana by The Offspring. I was never a huge fan of this album. It's probably within the last several years I really started gaining more of an appreciation for it. I always liked Smash, which was like their huge album that really got popular, which I'll be talking about here in a second. But this is one that, like I said, I think has kind of grown on me, and I probably put it up there with Smash as one of the best punk albums of the late part of the 90s. So even with as big of an album as Americana was, and like I said, it was everywhere. You couldn't escape, Pretty Fly for a White Guy and some of the other tracks that were off there. It wasn't as big as the album that they released before that. Released back in 1994, that album is Smash. This one sold a little over 12 million copies. It was huge. This is their third album. If you're not familiar with their first couple of albums, go back and check out their self-titled album and Ignition. They're both great albums. A little bit different, a little bit harder than what Smash was, but Smash was the album that really put The Offspring out in the stratosphere and made them such a huge band. So the top 4 dominated by 2 bands that had a whole lot of crossover appeal outside of punk music, outside of punk fans. It really kind of drew people into the genre, and that's why they had the huge sales numbers that they did. But number 4, released in 2004, sold over 13 million copies. That album is American Idiot by Green Day. This is definitely, I love Dookie, and Dookie will probably always be my number 1 favorite Green Day album. Nimrod's probably number 2. There's a lot of crossover success with Nimrod also, but with American Idiot, I think it put Green Day into a completely different stratosphere from a lot of other bands. Made them one of the biggest bands in the world. Of course, they went on and did Broadway musicals off of this album, things like that. A lot of different things that punk bands probably weren't doing in the early part of the 2000s. I probably don't even consider this really a true punk album. A lot of really kind of straightforward rock stuff on here, some alternative stuff. Obviously, there's a lot of punk influence on here, but it's a fantastic album and one I still love. So the album at number 3, I knew it was a huge album. I knew it sold a whole lot. I thought it'd be a lot lower on the list, maybe the 6 to 10 range. I had no clue it sold as many copies of this album as it did. But this was released back in 2001, sold 14 million copies, which is a whole lot. That's a ton for a punk band. That album is Take Off Your Pants and Jacket by Blink-182. I love this album. Blink is definitely one of my top 3 bands. I love everything that the band has done. But this album was very different because what they did with Enema of the State, there was a lot of... it's a fun album. There's a lot of really fun stuff on there outside of like Adam's song. But with Take Off Your Pants and Jacket, the band started introducing a little more darker themes that they would really continue on the Untitled album. And there's some like crossover hits on here that really kind of made this album as huge as it was. Like I said, 14 million copies. That's a ton for this album. I'm sure you can probably guess what the top 2 albums are. Both of them were huge albums when they were released. But then album number 2, it was huge. When it was released in 1999, it was everywhere. It was all over MTV. You couldn't get away from it. It was probably why it was such a huge crossover album for a lot of people. And this is probably an album that got a lot of people into punk in the late 90s, early part of the 2000s. I think that's probably why there was such a big boom in punk music during that, I'd say probably 4 or 5 year period. But the album is Enema of the State by Blink-182. Like I said, it was all over MTV. It was all over the radio. These guys were everywhere. One of the biggest bands in the entire world there for a couple of years. And I think, like I said, I think it was this album in particular and had such a huge crossover appeal and why punk music was so big there for a couple of years. So the album that's at number 1, easily the best-selling punk album of all time, sold over 22 million copies, was released back in 1994, and it was just everywhere. This is an album that got me into punk music, got a lot of my friends into punk music also. From here, a lot of people would discover Rancid, they would discover Operation Ivy, The Clash, the Ramones, a lot of other really great stuff in punk music that had come out previously. That album is Dookie by Green Day, and I know there's people out there that don't really consider this a punk album. even though it is it their most punk album? Probably not. I think Kerplunk is probably more of a punk album than this one is, but it's a great album. Of course, Green Day would go on, after this would do the Woodstock, the iconic Woodstock performance that I think really kind of helped propel this album as big as it was when it was released. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think of these albums. This isn't my list. This is all what I compiled as being the 10 best-selling punk albums of all time. So if you got different numbers, I mean, throw some things out there. I know if I were to kind of expand my definition of punk music, Avril Lavigne would have been at least a couple of albums on here, but I don't really consider her music punk. She doesn't really have ever released a punk album until just recently with Love Sucks. Her earlier stuff was definitely more of a, I think, alternative with some punk influence, maybe a little bit, but so stuff like that I kind of took out of there. So but drop me a comment down below. Let me know if you guys got different numbers out there. Love to know what you guys think of these albums. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep all spinning. Peace.